last, the epic journey of 1,000 bruised knuckles brings about new birth from the ashes of disuse and neglect. Very soon, this old girl will enchant all those who witness her glory, sweetly singing her siren song while revealing the virgin surfaces of imperfect wood. My plan for reassembly is to document what I do in the hopes that it might help someone down the line with assembling their own machine. If watching some guy assemble an old machine isn't your cup of tea, you're probably not going to enjoy this video. No harm, no foul. I purchased a Delta mobile stand to ease pushing this ample lady around the garage. I have no data on how much lateral force would be required to actually tip this thing over once it's fully assembled. It's probably a lot, but I went ahead and pre-drilled mounting holes anyway. Trying to muscle around 130 pounds of motor weight was not appealing. After pondering on how best to marry the motor and the stand, tipping it over on its side seemed the best choice. This allowed me to assemble the pivot rod and bolt the motor to the mounting flanges. Then I could tip the motor up into the stand and still have room to install the motor's tensioning bolt. The motor wiring has the older braided cloth covering, which was cracked and shredded in a few places. Although I couldn't see or feel the copper wire, I decided not to take any chances and further insulate each wire with shrink tubing. Each wire has a small numbered brass tag crimped on it that corresponds to a wiring chart on the motor body. I made sure to leave that tag visible in case I need to change the voltage at some point in the future. For now, the motor is wired to use 220 volts. I bolted the motor to the angle iron, but I left it somewhat loose in the slots so that I can adjust it later. The motor had to be nearly centered in order to tip it up into the stand. Once I did, then I could slide it out so that the pulley would clear the frame. The tension adjustment bolt fits through a slotted bracket at the top of the stand and secures to the motor via a hole in the mounting plate. This should allow the motor to be adjusted up and down in the stand to either increase or decrease belt tension. Next, I tipped the stand and motor onto the mobile cart and bolted it down securely. The planer's base was attached to the stand with 4 bolts. The first side panel could then be set down. You're going to want to leave this pretty loose so there's enough room to spread the top out and to drop the bed in place. The other side installs similarly. One of the sides has a bushing and a hole for the elevating shaft to pass through. Make sure this is on the same side as your motor pulley. The 2 column tie rods go in next. The hex screws on my machine were heavily rusted, so I used new fasteners after chasing the body threads with a tap. You don't need to tighten these much yet because you'll likely have to adjust them again later in the process. My tie rods fit too tightly in the holes to slide easily all the way through, so I installed one of the sides by lining up the parts and gently tapping them together with a mallet. Next step was to put together the gearing system in the base that raises and lowers the planer bed. Check the positions of the flats on the shaft before installing it. The widest section should go in first. As the shaft passes through the planer's side, you can install the first bevel gear. The teeth on this gear should point toward the side. You follow that up with a shaft collar on the inside of each mounting flange and a second bevel gear on the opposite side. Again, the teeth face the side. Both bevel gears should spin freely on the shaft at this point. The elevation screws go in next. Each has a shaft collar installed just below the threads. It's okay to go ahead and tighten these up. Install each with the threads facing up and slide a bevel gear over the shaft end. I had to do some fumbling around to get each of these placed correctly with the teeth just starting to mesh on each side. Starting on the side opposite the pulley, and once I had the elevation gear in approximately the correct position, I lightly tightened it up so it wouldn't spin. You are not going to want full tooth engagement at this point. With the shaft just meeting the inside edge of the gear, I got the teeth loosely meshing and then tightened the set screw on the gear. As you can see, the shaft still moves freely. Push the two gears together tightly and slide the shaft collar up to the mounting flange. Then tighten it. You'll still be able to pull the shaft back and forth some. Engage the gear teeth fully and tighten up the other shaft collar. This will prevent further lateral movement of the shaft. If you spin the shaft, the teeth should stay engaged and still move freely. The pulley side installs the same as the other. First, align the elevation gear and tighten it, then slide the shaft gear so that the threads fully engage, and then tighten it up as well. At this point, you should be able to spin the shaft and have both of the elevation screws turn smoothly. Mine was a bit too tight, so I made some additional adjustments to the spacing of the shaft collars and the gears until everything moved without binding. went ahead and installed the elevation hand wheel at this time. I temporarily moved the tie rods out of the way. The planer sides were still loosely bolted to the bottom, which gave sufficient room for me to drop the planer bed into place. It rests on top of the two elevation screws. You are going to want to get the bed as close to level as possible. To do this, both of the elevation screws have to engage the threads in the planer bed at the same time and in the same position on the screw. This required lowering the bed while watching where the screws were coming through. If I saw that they looked uneven, I'd back them out and rotate the elevation screw on the lower side about 1/4 of a turn so that I could try again. As you can see, I had to do this several times before I got a level planer bed. The bed position will have to be tweaked again later after you install the cutter head so that you can get the bed and the head parallel with each other. Two tie rods could then be reinstalled and tightened. These should still be a little sloppy so that you can fine-tune the bed's side gap. The planer bed maintains tension with the sides with a pair of gibs and some bolts and jam nuts. You'll need 6 of these to install the gibs. Slide the gibs in behind the bed and thread the bolts in until they just touch. You don't want these tight yet. I initially threaded mine in way too far. Test to see if the bed moves easily. In my case, it was very difficult to change the bed height. To fix this, I had to make some tweaks to how tightly the bed was being squeezed between the sides. Make sure there's a small space between the bed and the side, maybe a couple sheets of paper worth, by loosening the tie rods and then opening and closing the sides until the gap on both sides is even. Next, I loosened each gib adjustment screw and then tightened them back in until they just made contact with the gib, and then tightened each of them about 1/8 of a turn. Lock the gib screw in place with the nut while holding the screw with a screwdriver so it doesn't move. It's a bit like adjusting valves on a car. At last, the bed moved up and down almost effortlessly. It was a great feeling. I took a die grinder with a Scotch-Brite pad and cleaned off the paint overspray on the bed. Then I waxed the surface using some paste wax. This is a great product for protecting the cast iron surfaces of your tools. Just smear it around, let it dry, and buff it back off. The bed rollers are adjusted up and down in their slots using 4 bolts with jam nuts. I threaded them into the bed until they just started to protrude. You can leave them at that level for now. The roller height will be adjusted later. The bed rollers themselves are installed with a pair of bearing blocks. Older versions of this planer apparently didn't come with brass inserts, but mine did. They slide pretty easily into the planer bed and should rotate freely once installed. If they don't, check for debris at the bottom of the slots that may have cocked one side higher than the other. Coming up next time will be the rolling bits and the gearbox.